Golden State Media Concepts bring you Book Review Podcast, a haven for bookworms of all ages and the widest genres, from mystery to memoirs, romance to comedy, fantasy to sci-fi. If you love to read, this is a podcast for you. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Sarah, and I am happy to be with you again on this Thursday for our second podcast of the week and my second author interview of the week. I am talking with author Julia Whelan on today's podcast about her book, My Oxford Year. And before we get started on the book, I will just throw out that it is another book opportunity, or another opportunity for a book giveaway. So stay tuned, and at the end of the podcast, I'll tell you a little bit more about how you can enter in to one of the giveaways to win a copy of Julia's book, My Oxford Year. So a little bit about this book. American Ella Duran has had the same plan for her life since she was 13: study at Oxford. At 24, she's finally made it to England on a Rhodes Scholarship when she's offered an unbelievable position in a rising political star's presidential campaign. With the promise that she'll work remotely and return to DC at the end of her Oxford year, she's free to enjoy her once-in-a-lifetime experience. That is, until a smart-mouthed local who is too quick with his tongue and his car ruins her shirt and her first day. When Ella discovers that her English literature course will be taught by none other than that same local, Jamie Davenport, she thinks for the first time that Oxford might not be all she's envisioned. But a late-night drink reveals a connection she wasn't anticipating, and what begins as a casual fling soon develops into something much more when Ella learns Jamie has a life-changing secret. Ella is faced with a seemingly impossible decision: turn her back on the man she's falling in love with to follow her political dreams, or be there for him during a trial neither are truly prepared for. As the end of her year in Oxford rapidly approaches, Ella must decide if the dreams she's always wanted are the same ones she's yearning for now. That is the description of My Oxford Year by Julia Whelan. It's such fun. I mean, I would love to go visit Oxford. It's always been a place on my list of places to visit and to see. I don't know that I am cut out to study at Oxford necessarily, although it sounds like an amazing experience and one that I did not have an opportunity to do in my life. But just the history there, and it's kind of got this mystique. And so to read this book and to know that Julia herself spent a year studying at Oxford, she spent her junior year of college at Oxford, which is to me just amazing, wonderful. That sounds so exciting. I was excited to read this book simply because it took place at Oxford. It is a romance in some ways. You know, there's this relationship between Ella and Jamie, and I'm not going to talk too much about that because I don't want to give anything away. But it's also Oxford itself is almost another character. Just Ella's experiences there, learning the culture, meeting other students, and I kept Googling things because I wanted to know exactly what things looked like, what I was picturing in my mind, if I was picturing it correctly. And you'll get that a little bit in the interview. I ask maybe ridiculous questions of Julia because I'm just so curious and I'm so fascinated by this. I would love to have studied abroad, and since I didn't, I get to read books about it, which is the next best thing. So that is awesome, frankly. I said that Oxford is almost another character in this book, as well as poetry. Each chapter starts with a bit of poetry from the era that Ella is studying. She's studying a very specific time in literary history. And so each chapter begins with a snippet of poetry from that era. So you get to see some of the poetry that she is studying. And this really is a literary novel because Ella and Jamie and Ella and some of her other friends at Oxford really have these wonderful intellectual conversation about poetry, about literature, and that's not everyone's cup of tea. And yes, I did just say cup of tea when referring to an English novel, a novel set in England. But, some people might hear that, oh, literary fiction, that's not my thing. Or some of you might hear it and say, yes, please sign me up. I so want to read that. But it's really woven into the story so that, as I said, Oxford and the poetry are almost other characters. They're so integral to the story, but you don't ever feel bogged down by the intellectual, the academic conversations, the conversations about poetry. I personally don't know a lot of about poetry. I'm familiar with a little bit of a lot of different types of poetry and a lot of different eras of poetry, but I'm not an expert by any means on any specific era or any specific genre of poetry. And I didn't feel like I was overwhelmed by it. So it's just this really lovely undercurrent during the story, and kind of steers you along with these snippets at the beginning, and helps in the beginning to facilitate some conversation between Jamie and Ella. And so I've probably yammered on way too much now about poetry, but just so you know, there's poetry in the book, which is great. I'm going to let Julia talk about her book now, though, since it is her book and she knows way more about it than I do. So let's turn now to that interview with Julia Whelan about her book, My Oxford Year. Hi, Julia. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thanks for having me.
It's wonderful to have you here. We are here to talk about your book, My Oxford Year. Before we do that, though, I would love for my listeners to get to know you a little bit. So whatever you're comfortable sharing, that would be great.
Sure. So let's see. How do I start this? I was a child actor, actually. So my background is in acting, and I was on a television show called Once and Again. That was kind of the height of my work when I was in high school. And at that point, I decided, as the show was coming to an end, it was also the end of high school for me. And so I decided to take a break from the business and go to school. And I went to Middlebury College in Vermont. And from there, spent my junior year at Oxford, which is how that happened.
Okay.
And then when I graduated, I came back to LA and was pounding the pavement again as an actor and screenwriting, and slowly getting into audiobooks, which is now what I do mostly full time. I narrate audio and absolutely love my job.
Yeah. I love audiobooks, so that's awesome.
There we go.
What's your favorite audiobook that well, maybe not favorite, but what did you have the most fun doing?
I think you can say that's one of those. I mean, I've done, I think, over 300 at this point. And
Wow.
Picking a favorite is, I can't even say it's like picking a kid. It's like a spider picking a child. Too many.
There's too many.
But I have some soft spots. I did Gone Girl, which I loved, and I did. There's some amazing YA. Jandy Nelson's books come to mind, and then most recently I did Kristen Hanna's The Great Alone, which killed me. Just a beautiful book.
Oh, she's wonderful.
And Tara Westover's memoir, Educated, I also did recently, and that's also incredible.
Thank you. Fun. So back to your book. Tell us about the book. It's called My Oxford Year.
Yes, My Oxford Year is, I always feel like I have to say this, it is not a memoir. I keep having to make, but it is about a young American girl who is very driven and very ambitious, and she is a political operative in the States, and she gets a Rhodes to go to Oxford for a year, which is fulfilling a childhood dream of hers. And while she is there, things don't go according to plan, and she falls for a young professor who is hiding a secret. and that secret will potentially change the course of her life.
Right. And she, the book starts out just with a bang, because she's just landed and she gets a phone call to be part of possibly the next president's political campaign. And so she's in Oxford for a year, but she's also working. I mean, this woman is nothing if not driven and maybe a slight overachiever.
Yeah, yes, I would say she definitely falls into the overachiever category. What's funny, though, is that I wrote that because I knew, when I was there, I knew a number of roadies, and I myself was a Rhodes finalist, and so I know the kind of person that scholarship tends to select, and so it didn't seem like a lot to me, and then later I found out that I actually knew the son of someone that I knew who was there at Rhodes, who was there at Oxford on a Rhodes, was doing his course of study at Oxford and also remotely working for the Clinton campaign.
Oh, wow.
And I was like, see, this is what I'm talking about. Like, this is these people, and they're ridiculous, but that's who they are.
Right. Yeah, it's pretty amazing. So talk about Ella, who is the main character. What do you think about her will resonate with readers?
Right. So I think that she, as we said, I don't want to scare people off by saying she's an overachiever and she's very driven and very ambitious, because she actually is also, that's coming from a deeply idealistic perspective. She's not just a callous political operative. She actually is an education consultant for this campaign, and she's coming from the place of wanting to evolve education in the United States. And she is also deeply pragmatic and is a planner and is the sort of person who can have a good time and knows how to have friends and cut loose, but she is also deeply responsible and will show up the next morning at your apartment at the time she planned with your favorite coffee in hand. So she's good. She's a good friend, but she needs to learn how to chill.
Yeah. And like you said, we don't want to scare people off. She is very human, even, despite her driven sensibilities.
Yes.
I am going to jump in here so we can take our first break of the podcast. When we come back, we'll be talking a little bit more about this book and about some of the other writing that Julia has done, talk a little bit about any autobiographical elements that are in the story, etc. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
Do you want to be healthier, yet you just don't know what to do? All these shows telling you this and that, but nothing seems to work. Well, listen close. Golden State Media Concepts has got something great for you. The Health and Wellness Podcast dedicated to workout trends, healthy eating habits, diet, and everything about healthy living. Join us in our banters as we help you not just live life to the fullest, but live it to the healthiest.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and my interview with Julia Whelan about her book, My Oxford Year. Let's get back to that interview. Obviously, you spent a year at Oxford. This isn't a memoir, but what kind of autobiographical elements did you include in the story?
Other than the kind of details of what it feels like to be a young American woman who hadn't even been abroad before she landed in Oxford with the intention of being there for a year. I don't really share any autobiographical details with Ella. There's some deeper thematics as the book goes along of what she's learning and around the issue of choice and dealing with her own backstory. But I made a point early on, because all of my friends were a little bit nervous that I was writing about Oxford. And so I made a decision early on that there would be nothing autobiographical in the story. for their purposes, let alone mine. But I wanted to make sure that they knew I was not using anything from my actual Oxford year. So, which I did. I accomplished that. Nothing is in there.
Nice. And now I want to just be completely nosy about your time at Oxford because I find it fascinating. So what did you study while you were there?
So what was really unique about my time at Oxford, Middlebury College, my home institution, has a kind of boutique relationship with Lincoln College, which is Jamie's college in the book. And what is nice about that is that I was there as a fully matriculated student. I was given Bodleian rights. I was given access to professors. I basically joined in my junior year. I joined the incoming freshman class at Lincoln College. And that's different from the way that most Americans go to Oxford, where you just kind of are sent there, you're living with other Americans outside of the city, you're given teaching assistants who give you classes, but it's really, it's not as immersive as the situation I was in. And I actually am an alum as a result of that. And what was great about this is that you come in with a class, these colleges are small, so I think there were 7 other people that were studying English that were coming in that particular year. And over the course of the year, in each term, they, at the end of their year, will actually have to sit exams. And those exams are the things that determine whether they can continue into their second year or not. So it's very high pressured. At that point, because I wasn't staying, I was able to spend my last term doing independent study and focusing on what I wanted to focus on. And what I was studying at that time was, okay, get ready.
Okay.
the Victorian appropriation of the Middle English Arthurian legends. So I was major nerd.
That's really specific.
But what I was looking at specifically was how the Arthurian legends came back with a vengeance under Victoria and why, and who was working on them. And Tennyson was actually kind of at the head of that. He's the guy that started it, and then obviously by being poet laureate in 1850, he was carrying that torch. So when it came time to kind of select what Jamie's focus would be, I went right to Tennyson because that was what I knew.
Right. And so there are a number of different colleges that are part of Oxford, and so I'm going to just be kind of a dumb American here because when it's described, this place sounds huge, but I'm guessing it's probably not as big as it seems, just because
the town or the individual colleges.
Either one. I mean, just kind of explain how the whole thing works with the individual colleges, how they are part of the whole.
Sure. Okay, so the university itself has maybe between undergrad and graduate, I haven't looked at stats in a while, but I would say around 35,000 students. But those are broken up into these individual colleges. And in the colleges, you maybe have 300 to 400 undergraduates and then 200 graduate students. And then there are people that are just there at Oxford who are affiliated with colleges but are doing research work or something like that. And the point of these colleges, so remember that when you enter into Oxford, you enter into a course of study. You already know what you're doing. It's not an American system where you have 2 years of gen ed, let's say, and then you specialize. You come in knowing you're going to be doing English or history or sciences. So you are assigned a college, which is your place of residence. It is a place where you have your first tutorials. And usually, like at Lincoln, for instance, in the English, if you're doing an English course there are 3 professors that are affiliated with Lincoln who have their offices there who teach English. And they're usually separated by Old English, Middle to Renaissance English, and then anything later than that. And you have your first tutorials there, you're taking classes in college, but then the university structure as a whole is that there's each faculty, so like the English faculty, will have lectures throughout the terms where those same tutors that you're working with, but also tutors from the other colleges, lecturers will stand up and give their papers on whatever their particular specialty is. Mm-hmm. So that's where you are then in with all of the English majors at the university. Everyone shows up to those lectures.
Okay. Thank you for indulging me in that.
Sorry, that was
no.
That was probably more than you needed, but
no, I appreciate it.
I think it's a very good system because it creates an intimacy in your college, but it also, you have access to the entire structure of the university.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. No, I really appreciate that. Because I'm trying to picture everything and work it out in my head, and so that's really helpful. What kind of research did you do for the story? Obviously, you've lived there, but did you research more of the political side?
Yeah, I did. Right. So I did some research into that. I come from a pretty politically active family, so I have a sense of how those things work. And then for me, I mean, because I was at Oxford as an undergraduate, I assumed that I knew nothing about graduate study there. So I enlisted the help of a couple of friends to walk me through that, not only what Ella would be doing in her Master of Studies, her 1 year there, but also what Jamie is doing and what his position is. And so I needed to figure that out. And it's a weird kind of archaic system where like everybody has a different title and they're very clear about, that's why when Jamie says, we should clear this up, I'm not a professor. That's pretty much the first thing that anybody said to me was, no, that's not, this is what I actually am. So that needed to be researched. And then obviously later on in the story, all of the medical situations that comes up, that was probably what I spent the most amount of time researching.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Mm-hmm. You adapted My Oxford Year from a screenplay. So can you talk a little bit about that process?
Sure. So the screenplay that was originally written was by Alison Burnett, who's a really wonderful screenwriter. And when it was set up at a studio, different writers were hired to work on it, which is a very typical, that's the way these things usually happen. And so after, I don't know how long it was actually set up there, but eventually my friend and I were brought in to work on it as kind of the Oxford experts. But what ended up happening is we were also the first young women who had been attached to the project and working on it. So we had many opinions. And we ended up doing a pretty extensive rewrite on it and working on it for about a year. And at that point, I was going through, personally, a lot had happened in my life, and there were many things about this story that I wanted to spend more time on, particularly around the concept of grief and dying. And so those are just not things that often end up in a studio screenplay. Mm-hmm. And when the opportunity came up, when someone had this crazy idea of like, okay, well, what if we novelized this? Is that something you'd be interested in doing? I jumped so high, I hit the ceiling. I was so excited to do this, to take on that challenge and that project, and worked on the book for probably I think a year and a half maybe total before it was picked up, and I just was able to kind of tell my version of this story and everything that was important to me at that point.
Time to take our second and final break of the podcast, but when we come back, we'll be wrapping up this interview with Julia, finding out a little bit more about where you can find her on social media, all those wonderful wrapping up kind of questions. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and the conclusion to my interview with Julia Whelan about her book, My Oxford Year. And so, how is writing a novel different than writing a screenplay?
Well, I love them both for very different reasons. I think that it's important to remember that a screenplay is really a blueprint. It's not a finished product necessarily unto itself. It is the uniting thing that anyone who joins this project, it's like the document that everyone goes back and consults. So it's there to kind of to make sure everyone's on the same page. The visual that I often use in describing this is that it's like if you think about an old Hollywood Western, like the main street of a Hollywood Western or the high street, you have the facade and it's propped up by 2x4s. And everyone kind of knows that if they're working on the project, they know how to position themselves. They know where to put the camera so that you never see those 2x4s. Mm-hmm. With a novel, that set has to become inhabitable. You have to be able to open closets and look under the stairs and open windows. And you have to create the fully realized world on the page because no one else is going to do it for you. There's no director. There are no actors. So for me, this process became one of pouring foundation and putting up walls and making it inhabitable.
Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So what's next? Are you working on another book or are you moving in a different direction?
I am. I'm working on another book, but it's early days, so not prepared to talk about it yet. But I also have a couple of screenplay irons in the fire, and of course audiobooks.
Mm-hmm.
And so yeah, I've got a full plate at the moment.
Sure. So you came at this type of writing at least a little differently, a little later in life. But is writing in general something that you've always wanted to do, or did that just kind of evolve?
Yes, I've wanted to write as long as I've wanted to act. And when I say that, I mean 5 years old. It was something that I always knew I wanted to do. I was certainly writing screenplay pretty early, from like high school onward, because that was what I was reading most. And it is, I think, to this day, the way that I think of stories. I think in characters and dialogue. But when I left the business for a while to go to college, I didn't do theater and I focused on writing. So I was in the creative writing program at Middlebury and writing mainly short stories, very literary minded. And then when I graduated and started doing audiobooks, I was actually reading great popular literature for the first time in forever, and realized that by just reading voraciously for my job and across genre and category, it reignited those fiction impulses that I have.
Mm-hmm. This is slightly off topic, but I was just thinking back to the book and Ella's focus on poetry, and she and Jamie talk a lot about poetry. Are you a fan of poetry? Are you a fan of this specific period of poetry? Poetry really plays a big part in the book, so talk a little bit about that.
It does play a big part. And the joke of this is that, first of all, so when I was there, I mean, I was doing the Victorian Arthurianism, but I was more than anything really into those long, doorstoppy Victorian novels. which is why Middlemarch is in the book as well. But that's a hard thing to make accessible to people if they haven't read the book. It's difficult. Poetry is something digestible that I could actually put on the page. And while I was in school, I didn't love poetry. I was a fiction person, both as a writer and a reader. And I remember I had this he must have been in Jamie's position, now that I think about it. He must have been a JRF the poor thing was tasked with having just 1 hour a week to do a poetry class. And I was probably so awful to him because he would give us these poems to read, and then we were supposed to talk about them. And a lot of that tutorial came out of that because I was just like, it doesn't matter. I don't need to do this because I understand. I get it. I get what is happening here. And he's like, but feel it. And I'm like, it doesn't matter. So, but what ended up happening is I was writing this book. I kind of fell in love with Victorian poetry as I was picking the poems that start. Each chapter begins with a little snippet of poetry, and I was using the anthology that I had at Oxford, which I had Post-its in, and it was kind of like messages to my future self. And, you liked this poem. You should write about this one. This one's good. And I think just my own maturity and, the way that life takes you, what I had grown up, what I'd learned over the last decade, I suddenly appreciated the poetry in ways that I hadn't before.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So do you have a favorite thing about writing?
Sure. There's that thing that's saying, I think the best thing about writing is having written. The process of writing can often be painful, but man, I love having written. For me, what I love about writing is, and it's directly opposed to acting, which is that it is in my control. I can sit down when I want to. I can write without anyone having to let me write. And so I appreciate the freedom and the autonomy that writing affords. And yeah, when you're in that zone and just hours disappear, it's a pretty incredible feeling.
Mm-hmm. How about a least favorite thing about writing?
The writing. No. No, I think I mean, at this point in my life, I've spent as a kind of professional writer for hire in many respects, and all this feels right. And that can be tricky because I miss those days of, just kind of opening up something when you feel like it and working on it when the mood strikes you, and that is just kind of unrealistic in this, the system that we have.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Do you have then advice for other authors?
Aspiring authors?
Sure.
I can't do successful authors.
Well, yeah, I mean, sure.
Yeah, I think, everyone will give you this advice, but just keep writing. This is not the first book that I wrote, and even though it came about in this kind of unorthodox way, it was never a sure thing. None of us were sure that it was going to work, but I at least had the confidence that I could do it because I'd been writing for years, not just in college, but after. And I have plenty of drafts of things that are sitting in a drawer that will probably never see the light of day, and frankly probably shouldn't see the light of day. But that's how you get better. This is one of those things where you can really only get better by doing it. And so, not to be that person, it's not like people need one more voice saying this, but just keep writing. Keep writing at every stage. Keep writing when you've got a draft and you're sending it out and you're querying it. Keep writing, because an agent's going to ask you, what do you have next? What are you working on next? Mm-hmm. And you just have to just keep going.
Sure. Okay. Thank you. How about when you actually have time to read for yourself, which it sounds like you're very busy, but do you have favorite authors or genres?
Well, because I record about 70 audiobooks a year, and so, and I read those books twice, because I read them once to prep them, and then I read them when I'm actually recording them. Mm-hmm. So my reading for pleasure time is just nil.
Right.
But I love any book that subverts expectation. And it doesn't matter what genre or category it may be, but there's something that does, a book that does something different. So like Gone Girl is a good example of that, where that's a thriller, and I don't typically pick up thrillers. It's just that it's not what I usually enjoy reading. But I would have read that book if it had just been about that marriage. And I think that that's something that, like, that's what I look for, is the books that are that have something else going on, that work on a number of different levels.
Okay. Where can people find you? Do you have a website? Do you have social media?
I do. So my website is www.jmwhelan.com. And then on social media, I'm at just Julia Whelan across all platforms.
Thank you. That is helpful.
Sure.
What else would you like for people to know? Anything that we haven't talked about that you want people to know about writing or your book or screenplays? Anything that we haven't touched on?
Oh, let's see. I think that just to talk about the book a little more for a second, this is my goal anyway when I was writing it, is that it would appeal kind of cross-generationally. And I think that even though it's about a 24-year-old, the larger theme of choice and defining who you are and learning who you are should resonate across generations. And that's how I approached it. And I think that there's, beyond the love story, which I think is how people are perceiving it kind of at first blush, it's also a story about family and intergenerational conflict. And it's a fish out of water story, and it's a coming of age story, and it's also about poetry, and it's definitely for litmus. And so I think people are finding that, you know, I'm seeing that it's resonating on a number of different levels, but that's kind of what I want people to know, that I think you just maybe leave some expectations about what you think this is going to be at the door, because it's really its own thing. Right.
Yeah, I agree. Well, I would like to thank you so much for taking the time out of your weekend to talk to me. The book is My Oxford Year, and thank you so much for writing it and for talking to me about it.
Thank you for having me. This was great. And by the way, the person who suggested we talk, Robin Lee, her book is probably my favorite for pleasure book that I have read in the last year.
Yeah, The Idea of You?
Yes.
Yeah, and she just finished doing the audiobook for that herself, so...
She did. We talked about it, yes.
Awesome. Well, thank you again. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Once again, I do want to thank my guest, author Julia Whelan, for taking the time to talk to me about her writing, especially about her book, My Oxford Year. It's a really, really wonderful book if you are a fan of... British literature, if you're a fan of books set in England, if you're a fan of books that have kind of a travel element in them, if you're a fan of romance, this book has a little bit of everything. So definitely check it out. If you are intrigued about this book, by this book, and want to read a copy and want to read a free copy, which is always my favorite kind of book, then you should definitely take a chance and enter our giveaway. All you have to do is go onto our social media pages, Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram, or all three, or any combination thereof. It's not limited. And comment on episode 77. So I will post episode 77, and there will be a link on each of those social media pages. You just have to find that episode and comment on it, and you will be automatically entered into the giveaway for My Oxford Year by Julia Whelan. Again, that's Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Just go on and comment on episode 77. Thank you again to Julia. Thank you, as always, my listeners, for joining me and taking the time out of your day to listen to me talk about books, which is one of my favorite things. I hope that you will join me again next week. I have a third Tawny Mountain Mystery author joining me on Tuesday. Lori Fagan will be here to talk about her contribution to the Tawny Mountain Mysteries, as well as books that she'd written previously with the same character that is featured in her contribution to that series. So I'm really looking forward to speaking with Lori, and I hope you will join me for that. In the meantime, you have yourself a wonderful, wonderful weekend and go out there and get yourself lost in a good book. Thank you.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.